Hi, Volko.
Hello,
How are you?
I'm very well.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the presentation of the paper worlds that take us elsewhere and elsewhere. I'm very glad to introduce Volko Ruhnke, a board game designer, mostly historical board game designer, whose latest release game, Nevsky, includes our Lithuanian-only king Mindaugas, and on Twitter he's sometimes the MVP, as I've heard. But who's also done professional design games for the US institutions, and who is now very active in popularizing the hobby, including via the recently launched Zenobia Award and many other activities. And today, Volko will talk about historical games and how they interact with fiction and they can inform fictional games as well. One specific rule that we've agreed up yesterday, that whenever any one of you has questions, just raise your hands and we'll stop and answer the questions straight away rather than keep them for the end. Of course, I mean, if you have some questions at the end, that's fine. But whenever a question comes up, raise your hand, we'll discuss the question you want to discuss and then move on. Is that so? Okay, so then the floor is yours, Volko, and please.
All right, thank you, Piers. Thank you for everyone for letting me share a little bit of your day and talk about my favorite topic, which is board games. I'm going to try to, let's see if this works here. I'm trying to share my screen and get to my presentation. And I will presume you'll stop me if that isn't working somehow, but yeah, hopefully
it works. All good.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, paper time machines, I'm going to be talking about board games and how they transport us. And I want to start with a little bit of background on my perspective of this topic. And I won't bore you with this too long, but going back to when I was in grade school in the 1970s, I was very much into science fiction and fantasy, but especially what that meant at that time was the original Star Trek. That was what was around. And our fantasy and science fiction conventions in those days, we actually just called them Star Trek conventions. That's how dominant that was. And if you think about the title of that series, Star Trek, Trek means journey or travel. And already the idea of going and exploring some other world was really a big part of what drew us to that. But then I had a very strangely paired second big interest, which was in history and military history in particular. And one of the topics that we spent a lot of time on in those days, for example, was the Eastern or Russian front of World War II. So those were kind of my two main hobby interests as through high school. And then in the 1980s, I went to college, and I went to the College of William and Mary, which is a place where history is very present and important, because William and Mary is the second oldest college in the United States, going back to the 17th century, which in the US context is old. And so between those two different hobbies, I really, perhaps influenced by that environment, charged forward with my love of history. I majored in history as a college student, and I got more and more into ever more complicated board games about history, historical war games. And sometime in the 1990s, I started tinkering with them, trying to improve them or expand them. And starting in 2000, I was designing my own and publishing historical board games through the publisher GMT Games in California. And so I definitely made a choice to specialize in the historical part of my original hobby loves, but I always look back and remain interested in speculative worlds, in far future of humanity, of course, or just other worlds where the rules, the inhabitants, and the terrain are a little bit different, and have thought a lot about why was I originally attracted to both of those things at the same time. So what I thought would be fun today would be to look at board games as a bridge between these two kinds of interests. And I'm proposing, although I'm not equipped to be a deep critic of science fiction or fantasy genres, I don't really necessarily know enough to do that, but my observation is that works that seem to be influential and popular and fascinating to us in science fiction and fantasy seem to model themselves on real life human history. That these authors and filmmakers are borrowing from real humanity to perhaps show us how their world works, how it's coherent, how it fits together, and the people or creatures who populate it behave in plausible ways. And these creators of this fiction must be looking to human history to do that. And in both of these cases, fiction and real history, I'm going to argue, board games are a very powerful medium to take us there, to transport us into other worlds, whether they're on the planet Earth and just geographically and chronologically distant from us, or they're other worlds that somebody has invented. And how board games do that and what we can enjoy in these games, therefore, is really quite similar. And if we think of science fiction and fantasy as speculative, as really speculative history, because a lot of it is based on dynamics from real human history, then we should realize that games that are about real history, about what happened, are automatically also speculative. Because what games do that just hearing a story or watching a film cannot do is they allow us to experience and try out and even decide what did not happen, but plausibly could have happened, what might have been. If the game cannot do that, it's not a game, it's just a narrative. And so automatically a game about the Vietnam War, for example, is going to be speculative, and perhaps in a similar way that science fiction and fantasy are speculative. So why board games in particular? So simulation games of any kind, games that represent a world, they're just very powerful because they let us not just observe motion and interaction dynamics as they play out, but let us climb inside the machine and pull a lever or push a button and see what happens. And so we get to, in a game, experience the world in a very special way in which we interact with it and it interacts with us. And board games, as compared, for example, to computer games, in my view, do that. Let us climb inside the machine, especially well, because we're not relying on computer code or some other hidden aspect to operate the models in the game. We learn the rules, we execute the rules, and when we try something, when we experiment, we can see exactly why what just happened because we are operating the model ourselves.
Excuse me, Volko, we have already
Yes.
one question, so.
Yes.
Hello. I have a question that's maybe a bit out of left field, but how do you feel about role-playing games in this context of climbing into the machine, to the machinery of the world, of the situation, but also taking into account the maybe motivation of the actors inside and the different dynamics that's not purely mathematical, but also on some kind of feelings level?
So role play does this also, and also in a very powerful way. And these different media, computer games, board games and role play games and others we can think of, they all have different strengths and weaknesses. So a computer can involve a lot of detail, a lot of data, a lot of computation that we don't have to worry about to give us very finely granular models, if you will. But a lot of that is hidden from us, and that's a barrier. So that's what I was mentioning about board games. With role playing, we can tap not only the model of the designer or the game master, but it's especially powerful for drawing in the expertise and the creativity and the in-game innovation of the players because it's so open. There's some of that in a board game, but the board game has to present a closed rule system. And so really what you're getting when you play a board game is you're getting a designer's or design team's model of the world. Whereas in role play, you are getting that, but with a lot of room for the players to use their own imaginings, view, knowledge, and expertise about that setting to help drive what happens. And so that's recognized in professional gaming as well. A great deal of educational simulation gaming and analytical and research simulation gaming is in fact role-playing games. So I have a great respect for the power of it. Board games tend to fascinate me because I am interested in forcing and then a designer and then seeing what that designer comes up with, forcing a designer to create a complete model that operates whatever the players decide to do ahead of time, right? That answers all the questions of what happens next ahead of time, a closed system, the way that you don't really have to do with a role play game because you're presuming there's a game master there who can decide as you go, well, how do we resolve this? So I've just used some kind of fancy words and I want to define these because I'm going to keep using them. And it's this because I'm going to be talking about these board games as dynamic systems models or as models of dynamic systems, both of those. So I just want to say, what do I mean by each of those? So a system, when we think about some other world, it is a system and there are systems within it. And what we mean by that is there are parts, they could be actors, they could be factors that are interacting with each other. And they're not just interacting chaotically, but there are some rules that guide what might happen. And they might be very tight rules, such as the way in the solar system, gravity affects the movement of the planets. There's not a lot of leeway there. It always works a certain way. Or they might be very flexible and loose rules, like in a human organization or society, a rule might be that we look out for our own interests while also trying to help others. So there's a lot of room there for adaptation, if you will. So in those cases, those systems of interaction like that, for the sorts of systems we're interested in, humanity, human systems, there are dynamics. That is, that there is motion within those rules. These actors and factors are affecting each other in ways that change, and their positions change, their status changes, maybe even the rules change. And that's what dynamics reminds us of, is movement and change. And finally, a model, all I mean by that is that these systems in the real world are so complex and detailed that to understand them, we simplify them to some specific purpose, such as to focus on this or that aspect. We might leave some things out and simplify to focus on just certain parts of the system dynamics. So we're going to be talking about these board games as such purposeful simplification of the dynamics of systems in other worlds or the other world itself as a system. And I'm going to talk about these three pairs, couplets of games, because for the fantasy and science fiction games, they happen to be very popular settings. I think they're popular and very excellent games. And in each case, I'm just going to look at, just sample some ways in which these games are similar in their systems models and what they're modeling, what they have to tell us about their worlds compared to historical games that I've done. So I'm not here going to show you a lot of here's the components in the game. I'm not going to teach you how to play the game. I'm merely going to sample what are some of the dynamics that the game has to show us that help transport us into these worlds. I'm just going to sample small little piece here and there in each case, in the hopes that that will be interesting enough that if you haven't already tried the particular game, you might be tempted to go play it. So let's start with Dune. And I hope many of you are as excited as I am for the new movie coming next month. I read Dune back in the 1970s. It was a great entertainment for me. I played the original Dune game in the 1980s, and I now spend a lot of time playing the modern version, and we have yet another version coming soon. And I think this is an interesting one to look at military economics. What are the roles of resources and money in warfare? And right on the top of the cover of the box, we see the phrase, "The spice must flow." So if you know this setting and story at all, you know that Dune is a desert planet that produces a substance called spice that is necessary in this interstellar world for space travel, because those who navigate through space use this spice to be able to do so. And that gives the planet Dune its importance in the story. So here's a look at the game. It shows the surface of the planet. It's really actually near one pole of the planet. Most of the planet is just plain desert. And up to 6 factions are going to fight to control the surface of Dune. And we can put that in the way of a very simple model, which is the box at the upper left here, that comes from the world that the author Frank Herbert created. Whoever controls the desert in this planet, the name of the planet is also Arrakis. If you control the Arrakis desert, you control the harvest of spice. And if you control spice, you control space. That is to say, you control commerce across the empire. And that's a set of rules, if you like. And we can get a little bit more detailed in this little diagram to the lower left and say, how do we control the surface of Arrakis? Well, with troops, you can control whatever part of the desert you need. If you do that, you can harvest spice, and spice, because it's in effect money in this civilization, you have the spice to pay for the troops to maintain the control. And so we have a loop, if you will, of a system dynamics at the strategic level that indeed plays itself out in the game. But I'd like to go in a little bit deeper and show you a little bit more what's happening here in the game that also reflects what happens in the fictional world of Arrakis Dune from Frank Herbert. So here is a close-up of the map board. And to control Dune, you have to control a majority of the dark colored spaces on the right, the strongholds, if you like. But to get the spice to be able to fund your battle to win these strongholds, you have to go out in the desert where the spice appears. And that's what we're looking at here. We're going to return to this picture. What I want to show you is, in the context of this battle, this context test for control of the surface of the planet, how does spice flow among the factions? So I'm going to build this up slowly in a little diagram that is itself a system dynamics model and represents, simplifies the dynamics in the game. So I'm showing here 5 different factions that are all fighting each other for control. And if we look at the upper right at the emperor sounds like he would be very powerful, and indeed he is. It's good to be the emperor because as the emperor, he can tax commerce, which means to the degree to which the other factions are spending spice to buy the weapons and equipment and treachery capabilities to fight each other for Dune, including fighting the emperor, some of that spice is flowing to the emperor. So our arrows here between the factions is the flow of the spice. Where is the money going? So the emperor is collecting up the money that everybody else is spending to buy these weapons. In the upper left, we have the spacing guild. So these are the navigators that actually use the spice to fly around space. And that means you need them to bring troops from other worlds onto Dune to fight for the planet. And so the Harkonnen and Atreides noble houses and the emperor too, if they ever want to bring any troops onto Dune, they're paying their spice to the guild. The Fremen at the lower right, well, they live on Dune. They don't have to do that. They're already there. They just appear from the southern deserts. Now, we need to have a source for this resource. How does spice get into the system? And that's through spice blows. That is, every once in a while, the spice, which is produced by these giant worms in the desert, blows up onto the surface, and you have to go out in the desert and get it. And so the Fremen, who already live in the desert, they have some advantage of going to the spice blows and getting it to support their expenditures. And finally, as far as the spice goes, the other factions also can go get it, but there are some difficulties. The sandworms who produce the spice tend to show up and eat you wherever the spice is appearing. So they're sort of a barrier to the collection of the spice from the desert. But the Atreides and the Harkonnen, because they control some of the 2 main cities, Arrakeen and Carthage, as shown, have the transportation to get out there, collect the spice quickly, and get it back. And meanwhile, the storms of sand blowing across the desert are blowing away the spice and can also kill you if it finds you. So that's sort of taking spice out of the system. And all the while, everybody is collecting this spice, buying weapons, bringing in troops, and as they battle each other, they're expending that resource to do so. So here's our full system. And again, this is just a part of what's going on in the game. This is just some of the flow of spice, this resource among the military. And it's showing us a few things in this chart, that the Fremen are a little bit disconnected from the rest of the system, that the guild and the emperor can be expected to be richer, but are dependent on what part of the conflict we're in terms of either purchase of weapons or transport of troops. And the Atreides and the Harkonnen probably are going to have the main need to go out there and risk the worms and storms and collect spice from the desert. The Fremen don't even need to pay to battle since they're like guerrillas, so they don't need as much spice, and they can control the worms and the storms fairly well anyway. But if we stand back from this chart, if you don't know the story and you don't know the game, and I show you this spaghetti chart, it's hard to take in. I don't know if you agree with me, but it's just very difficult to look at all of this, even though I've kind of laid it out and explained it step by step. It's kind of hard to say, okay, now I understand what's going on and how things work in terms of spice on Arrakis. And yet, as I said, this is a tremendous simplification. This doesn't show everything that's happening in the game. It doesn't even have all the factions. There's a 6th faction I haven't shown. I've simplified things just to be able to fit it on this screen. And I point all of that out because that's in contrast to the power of the board game itself. If you learn and play the game Dune, and it's not that hard of a game, maybe medium difficulty, you will understand all of these interactions and much, much more about the fictional world of Dune than I can ever fit onto a little diagram like this that I call a loopy diagram. You'll know many, many more interactions, and you'll understand them because you will have operated that yourself. And while this chart, this picture, is a model of system dynamics, motion, flow of spice, it is not a dynamic model. It just sits here. It suggests some things about these interactions, but cannot show you what might change over time. While the game Dune is a dynamic model of the dynamic system that is portrayed in the Dune books, and therefore is much more effective at showing us what might happen if we try this or that strategy. So going back to what the game looks like, we can now look at what's happening on the board in this left picture with a little bit more understanding. We see in the foreground, out on the desert flats, there are 10 spice, 2 spice. That's a spice blow. And 2 forces, this happens to be the Harkonnen and the Fremen, I think, have shown up to fight each other to collect this spice. So we have here this military principle of you're fighting for territory, not just for its military significance, but for its economic significance. And even though no people live out here in the desert, or few people do, it's worth fighting for because you need to collect that resource. And so that particular aspect of spice on Arrakis in the Dune books plays out on your game table in a very effective way. And we see the same kinds of principles in historical games. So here is just an example of a game I played a great deal going way back to the 1980s. And it has the same kind of idea. Instead of pieces showing spice, there are little pieces showing gold. In this case, this is the contest among kings and emperors and such in medieval Europe. And the spaces also have economic aspects to them. Each space, such as we see Lithuania in the lower center here, has a scale between -3 and +3 that just shows what is its current economic status. That changes dynamically. And the better the economic status, the more you can tax it, the more you can gather the gold pieces shown, and the better you can govern and fight to expand your kingdom and empire. So the particulars are very different, but the kinds of ways that this board game takes you into the military economics of European history are quite similar to what I just showed you in more detail in Dune. And we can look at my co-design Falling Sky, which is about Caesar's Gallic War, in a similar way. So what a lot of what we know about Caesar fighting the Gauls in the 50s BC is from his own memoir, The Gallic War. And from that, we can extract the following model, that one needed as a conqueror of Gaul to control the loyalty of enough Gallic tribes to be able to control them as a source of grain. And whoever can do that and controls grain can feed his armies enough to keep them in the field and thereby control Gaul. And so we have a very similar loop at the lower left. That's a strategic model, if you like, of military economics in Caesar's Gallic War. And if you've read this work, you may recall very often Caesar is worrying about where is he going to get the provisions to feed his legions. Are his friends, the Aedui, going to deliver the corn to him that they promised? Because if he cannot feed his legions, he cannot conquer Gaul. So this shows up in our game called Falling Sky, because we track both the loyalty of different tribal allies to the factions contending for Gaul, and we also track how many resources they produce and how those resources are used. And I'll go a little bit more quickly than I did for Dune and show you a little bit how this model works in this game, Falling Sky, this historical game, because I want to give you a sense of how is it similar and how is it different from Dune. So here we have our factions. In this case, we have 3 Gallic factions at the top and left. We have German tribes on the right and the Romans on the lower right. And this is about the situation as Caesar arrives in Gaul. So we see that 2 of these confederations, groupings of tribes, the Auvergne and the Aedui on the left, they are sort of battling back and forth for the loyalty of tribal allies. And the reason for that is they're not ethnically all that different, such as the Belgi or the Germani might be. They're rather different oligarchies, different leading tribes who are trying to dominate one another among the tribes of Celtica, of the main part of Gaul. And in come Caesar's legions, as you see. And one thing that these legions are able to do is they're very militarily effective. And by battling, they can draw away tribal allies from these various factions in Gaul. So what we're looking at with these colored arrows is different than what we looked at with the brown arrows in the Dune model. Here, what we're looking at is the dynamics of tribes, of tribal allies. And in this case, the legions are sucking away tribal allies from these different parties in Gaul by subduing those tribes. And something else the Romans do is if there's a tribe that's subdued, they can obtain and do obtain resources. So now we're back to something like spice, but in this case, it's really grain, cattle, to some degree silver, but basically the resources that the Romans need to operate their war machine, their legions. And if they control through the presence of legions on a certain territory, they control that territory with tribes in it, they can actually disperse those tribes in a punitive way, which means they're taking, the Romans are taking and enslaving a lot of those people, selling off those slaves back in the Roman Republic to get even more money to pursue the war in Gaul. So this is a very important part of the system of finance for the Romans in Gaul that's in the game. We also have, of course, the outflow of resources. There's some loss to raids, including by the Germans, spending on commands to march around or battle drains away resources. And what I try to show here with a thick arrow leading outward of resources away from the Romans at the lower right is that these legions, while very effective, are also very expensive to operate. So the Romans have a larger appetite for resources in Gaul and in the game than the other parties do. And that means even with their ability to seize resources from subdued tribes, it's not really enough to run their war machine. And so we get to a really critical relationship in Gaul and in the game. And that is between the Aedui Gauls, the Gallic Confederation under the Aedui tribe in blue, and the Romans in red. And it is this: the Aedui happen to live along the trade route with the Roman Republic. And so they can profit more than others from trade between Gaul and Rome, especially if the Romans grant them that supply line, because Caesar controls these entry points back to Rome. And so there's a reason for the Romans to cooperate with the Aedui, to give the Aedui more resources. And there's a reason for the Aedui, who need the Roman legions to battle against their more powerful rivals, especially the Averni that we see at the top of the screen. And so the Aedui transfer back some of those resources back to the Romans to fuel their machine, to keep the legions going to battle the Averni and Belgi. And that relationship between the Aedui and the Romans, both of which ultimately want to dominate Gaul themselves, but work together in these asymmetrical ways to dominate the other contenders. That relationship is key to what happens to Caesar in Gaul, because at one point in 52 BC, the Aedui turn on the Romans, or they turn on each other. And that's big trouble for Caesar, climaxing at Alesia. And in the game, it's the same thing. These two players tend to work together, but at some point, they have to turn on each other. And how and where and when that happens has a lot to do with how the game turns out and plays differently each time you go through these dynamics. So let me pause there and ask Pius, how are we doing? Is this coming through all right? Are there any questions or anything else that I can address?
I don't see any questions. Oh, okay, we have one question already. So yeah, I think just we're a little bit likely to step over time. So that's something for you to note.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Did you say there is a question?
Yep, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so one question relates to the creation of a new board game, historical one. What is the initial idea? Is there something specific period like Gallic War, I don't know, Grunwald battle or something like this? Or it's just system? Okay, I want to build a, I don't know, area control game with some unexpected events that will use some maybe dice as a special thing. Which comes first, the historical part or idea or game mechanics? And
excellent.
why,
and I think the answer is, for me, something that distinguishes between the games, the kind of games I like the best, which are these simulation war games, and many other board games. So many board games are about something. My approach, the games I design and the games I like most, you start with, what is the game about? What is the world I want to transport my players into? And then you go, okay, how should we represent that? What do we need to have? Do we need cards? Do we need map? Do we need area control mechanics? Do we need money in there? I start from that. I start from the history, in my case. How do I think this world works? I'm interested in this world. I'm interested in Caesar and Gaul. How does it work? Okay, now if I have some model in my head how this works, how do I represent that on your table? Right? Rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
All right.
The thumbs up were given. We have one more question, Volko.
Sure.
Actually, I have questions. So, hello. So games change, they get inspiration, from, let's say, from history and real conflicts. So I wanted to ask, what are the trendy aspects of the game, that are more popular now? So that is one question. And as you play many games, and games and sci-fi and so on helps you to find new scenarios, of conflicts. So is there some kind of new scenario, like conflict scenario, that playing games you found and would like to explore really, that didn't happen, in reality? So.
Yes. So I is what is popular, and I think so. Simulation games, going back to at least in the United States in the 1970s, were very much about wars, and especially big wars in Europe, or big wars in America. So since then, we've had decades of an explosion of all kinds of games, not just computer games, role-playing games, card-based games, and board games. And in that explosion, we have a huge variety of what these games are about. And there's in there some history, like used to be the main thing in my country, 40 years ago. There's some history, but mostly it's fictional. Mostly it's either a very generalized setting, like, growing cabbages and selling them to a medieval town or something like that. Or if it's specific, it's the kind of thing like Dune, or the other science fiction and fantasy games that I've talked. That kind of topic, fictional, speculative games, are much more popular than historical games, which are a smaller niche. However, what we're also seeing is crossover in the kinds of bridges that I hope to contribute to in this talk, in which, because somebody is interested in Dune, they play the game Dune, they think, well, what other board games are like this? And maybe they come to play a game about history in that way. And these historical games today are becoming more and more broad in the scenarios that they cover. It's not just World War II on the Russian front anymore, or the American Civil War, but any number of places and times and sorts of perspectives, military, historical, economic, political history, and so forth. And so that's where we are already moving, and I certainly hope to contribute to. So in terms of scenarios, I am not a great designer of fictional topics because I can't make those things up myself, and I don't have the access to, make a game about, Star Wars and sell it. I don't own that. So I go to history where the story is already there and it's free, and that's what I design. But I love to play them, and there's almost no scenario that I wouldn't be interested in trying out if the game offers an interesting model.
We have one more question.
One more, go.
Games tend to be somewhat formulaic in a sense that you have to have an element of playing it. You have to have gameplay loops that are overlapping or building up on each other. Have you encountered...
I'm sorry, it's very quiet.
Okay. Is it
better
better now?
Yes.
Games tend to have some formula in them, in a sense that they have to have a playing element, gameplay loops that are building on top of each other. Have you encountered any systems that are not really possible to be represented in games because of that? Systems that cannot be played, let's say, by different players competing to each other, or some concepts that are not really playable, not implementable in games.
I cannot think of any, and that is not to say that all of them have been represented, right? There are many dynamics and situations that are not yet in any games, but that just requires creativity in changing, recombining, and inventing new game mechanics. And the reason I say that with some confidence is that all of these situations that are based on human affairs, if we're talking about history or fiction based on history, they're all human systems. They're all what we call complex adaptive systems that have actors and factors, and there are aspects of how these systems behave that can be studied and analyzed, and for all their complexity can be described and modeled. And so it's almost as saying is there something out there that we cannot model? No, I don't think there's anything out there that if we understand something about how it works, we can represent those dynamics in various media. Now, some media are more effective than others. For some things, maybe a computer game is the better way, the better simplification. For some things, a chart like what I have up here might be all I need to show what I'm trying to understand. But a board game offers a great set of options, still unbounded. We're still inventing new ways to represent things in board games. And board games are very good I think, at showing the interaction of groups of people as actors, because we're using people to simulate people, just like in role play. Human beings, human players make great representations of humans in history or in fiction. So I can't think of any, only a challenge of how to do it.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks. So just to give you the time scale, I think we can have one more of the two topics that you've left time for.
Okay, so one more game or one more couplet of games?
I think a couplet for comparison, yeah.
Sure. All right, let's do that then. So let's go to War of the Ring. Hopefully a work that you know well. And my favorite game, there are many games set in this world, but my favorite one happens to be this war, based about the warfare, about military operations in this world, which is largely patterned on the medieval world. And on the box, it says epic battles in the lands of Middle Earth. So let's talk about epic battles. What we have here is strongholds that, as in the medieval world, give you control of land, which gives you the ability to muster armies that live on that land and feed from that land, to besiege and take strongholds, to control your enemy's land, to be able to keep that cycle going. And that model tells us also then how epic battles take place. And it turns out that the way that epic battles take place, why do we have these epic battles, is the same in Tolkien as it is in real life European medieval warfare. So here's a little system dynamics model of that. On the left, we have one side's strongholds, on the right, another. The side on the right is going to try to take away some land from the one on the left. And what they can do on their own land is muster. They can form their army. They can march up to the enemy, presumably with a larger army because they've started their muster earlier. They're strong enough to attack. And they're going to besiege that army. The weaker army wants to defend itself by going inside the walls. Once it's inside, it can no longer muster. It can't add to its military forces. However, the approaching army similarly cannot muster because it's now on enemy land. It doesn't control this land because it doesn't control the stronghold there. And so it too is stuck besieging the enemy without being able to muster. And here's what makes the epic battles happen. There are other defending strongholds who still can muster. And so they can muster a larger relief army that comes to chase away the attacker. And that would result then in an epic battle if the attacker wants to maintain its chance of taking this besieged place. Or maybe it presses an epic storm. That is, because the relief army is coming, the besieger can't wait for the people inside the town to starve or surrender and must attack the walls, which is very dangerous and expensive. But that's how we get epic battles and epic storms time and again in history. And if we think about that in terms of Middle Earth, in the War of the Ring, what you would see on the game table, this is my set. You have in the center, the blue are the forces of Gondor in their walled city, their stronghold of Minas Tirith. From the right, you have the forces of Mordor, which have mustered at their stronghold of Minas Morgul, and they're marching up to Minas Tirith to besiege it and possibly storm its walls. But fortunately for Gondor and Minas Tirith, they have friends elsewhere, the big army on the left in Rohan and perhaps the elves, who can still muster a relief army and march in and save Gondor. So this is in the book, of course, in the Return of the King. This is also a very typical situation to occur in the game. And if you want to look at it as an annotated graphical systems model, here's what's happening. Very, very close representation of a story you can find in medieval military history time and again. So in a game about actual historical medieval operations, which is called Nevsky, I try to show the same sorts of relationships in epic battles in the Baltic, if you like. So we have the same idea that these strongholds allow you to control the seats of lords, and it's those lords in their stronghold seats who are able to muster armies to besiege the enemy's strongholds and take control of those seats. And that's a lot of what's happening in terms of the operations in this game. So here it is, what it looks like on the board. Each of these cylinders is a lord. We have, in this case, the roles are a little bit reversed, right and left. We have the Russians in white on the right, who are defending the city of Pskov with a possible relief army coming from Novgorod. The Teutons from the west are besieging Pskov and have to decide, should they wait for that siege to force the surrender of the Russians, or should they storm it and risk attacking the walls before the relief army comes to chase them off. And in this situation, you very well might get an epic battle outside the walls of Pskov. We do a little bit more detail. Each of the lords is represented in terms of their military forces. Each of those cylinders is represented by a mat that has forces and special effects. So we're not just mustering number of units, but we might add crossbowmen or trebuchets to help with the siege. We also have resources here. There's coin and loot and provender. And so there's a military economy going as well. But again, I'm only showing you here sort of a particular aspect of each of these games. In fact, in the game, there's much more going on in all of these games I'm talking about. And I think, as you mentioned, P.S., yes, we have also something that's rather important in medieval warfare in this game, which is just ravaging the enemy's land. And in this case, can also happen, from the south by Mindaugas. So with that, I would be ready to move on to the third couplet, or we can pause there if it's time for everyone to move on to the rest of the convention.
Yeah, so it will be time, but I think we can still take some questions if you're good with that.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Hello, I have a question regarding the topic that we missed, the counterinsurgency games. So, considering the historical record of success in such operations that is pretty much slim to none, how do you envision victory for the legitimate government in a board game? And how do you keep it relatable to real life in some way or another?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, a terrific question. And actually what the next section would be about exactly, which is representing Star Wars as about insurgency. And how do the counterinsurgents win in real life? So I will take issue with your premise that the counterinsurgents have a hard time winning. If you look at insurgency and counterinsurgency over time, and there are of course experts who've done this, the government very often wins. Most of the time the rebellions fail. What we're familiar with is this example I'm showing here, which is expeditionary counterinsurgency, which is the same thing that the coalition was engaged in until recently in Afghanistan. That's a very different matter. And in the game, we give these foreign counterinsurgents a victory condition that they don't want to live there. They want to win a war and leave. And that makes it very difficult for them to partner effectively with the local government, the local counterinsurgents, and win. However, many insurgencies and counterinsurgencies are mainly domestic. There is a government that is trying to put down a rebellion. And in that case, the government does live there and it wins by extinguishing the rebellion. And that happens historically many times. So we have a lot of options, but we have to take this difference into account. And if you play any of my games about insurgency, I think you will see this play. You will see this play out. And I probably don't have the time to give a full answer of exactly how, but but we need to consider, are we talking about a foreign counterinsurgency or the government that is going to try to live there forever?
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions? I don't see, so I'll take the opportunity to ask one. So fictional and historical games, well, when it comes to games, one of the challenges, especially for more complex games, is internalizing the rules. And for which one do you think it's, I mean, for historic games, you usually know at least a little bit of history that you're going to play because you are getting into that game. So, I mean, it makes sense that you get to the rules, and if they mechanically interact with the topic, then it's easy for you to intuitively grasp what they're telling you. Do you think that fictional games have this potential shortcoming in helping the players or leading the players to learning the rules or memorizing the rules more easily?
I'm not sure if can you say that again? I'm not sure if I understand the question. Do fictional games, is it easier to learn the rules?
No, so that when you play, for example, a historical game, you know a bit of a history of what you're playing about, usually because you chose the game to play. And if mechanics are integrated with the topic, like in simulation games, so you internalize the rules more intuitively, while for fictional games, the rules, I mean, it might be more difficult to grasp because you don't necessarily know the material that well.
Okay, I think I absolutely agree that for games that are about something, the more you already know that setting, that something, the easier it will be intuitively to understand the rule. Because in a simulation game, every game rule both has to have the right impact for gameplay and has to have the right representational purpose, right? It has to be part of the model. And if the rule meets that standard, then the fact that it's representation helps you intuitively to remember it. And we use this in playtest. If we aren't remembering a rule as we playtest it, it might be that it's not doing what it needs to do in the model. The second part of that, though, is what kinds of worlds do we know a lot about? We might come to a game to learn about something we don't know anything about, but we want to, or we might come to a game because it's already a topic that we love and have read a lot about and even played other games about. And that seems to me true potentially equally, whether it's fiction or history. If I know Frank Herbert's Dune very well, that's going to help me learn to play the game Dune. If I know the history of the Vietnam War, then that's going to help me play Fire in the Lake about the Vietnam War. It's going to help me learn those rules to the degree to which those rules do a good job simplifying reality. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure. Thanks for the answer. Are there any final questions? Yeah, okay, one more final question.
So my question is, how to, can I get a second to formulate that?
Could you perhaps, it's very quiet on this end, if you can get closer to the mic?
Now it's better?
Better.
Okay, so how to, kaip pateikti angliškai? Kaip pateikti taisyklę, kad jinai žaidime, ta prasme, kaip perteikti kažkokį dalyką žaidime mechaniškai, kad jis būtų kuo įdomesnis.
Okay, so the question was how to make a rule or some aspects of the mechanics in the game so that it is interesting or it becomes interesting. Did I get the question correct? Okay, the question is to this.
Yeah, and it goes back to what is the purpose. I'm hoping the kind of games I like, they're interesting because they represent some world, okay, that's interesting in some way. And so if I can give you rules like victory conditions, ways to pursue them, things you're doing, and means, tools and resources to execute those ways to pursue your victory conditions, if I can give you all of that in a way that represents what real actors were doing or what fictional actors are doing in a story, then those rules are probably going to be interesting because the world is interesting, history is interesting, human interaction is interesting, and successful science fiction and fantasy works are crafted to be interesting. So if my game rules make you feel like you're in that situation, the likelihood that the gameplay, that the competition, the strategy formulation, the uncertainties, the risks, the victories, the cooperation to achieve a common goal, that all those things will be interesting in the game, just as they would be interesting in the world being represented. That's my approach anyway, to try to make a fun game.
Okay, so thanks. That was all. Thanks a lot for joining us today. And yeah, have a nice day. It's still a whole day for you.
Thank you very much and have a great rest of your con.
Thanks. Bye.